Griffin Ashford signed his name with such aggressive flourish that the Mont Blanc pen nearly tore through the paper. Then he threw his head back and laughed, a sound so cruel it seemed to suck the warmth from the room. He didn't know that the signature he'd just scrawled had transformed him into the poorest man in Chicago. The conference room on the 48th floor of the Willis Tower offered a panoramic view of the city below, but the atmosphere inside felt suffocating despite the sleek glass walls and climate control humming quietly in the background. Late afternoon sunlight slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany table where the final dissolution of a 10-year marriage was being reduced to paperwork and legal formalities. Griffin sat on one side of that table, a monument to American success, in his Brooks Brothers custom suit that cost more than most people earned in a month. His dark hair was precisely styled, his Patek Philippe watch caught the light with every gesture, and his face, handsome in a sharp, predatory way, was twisted into an expression of pure triumph. Next to him sat Preston Locke, a lawyer whose hourly rate of $850 spoke to his reputation as one of Chicago's most ruthless divorce attorneys. The stack of crisp, white documents before them represented months of legal maneuvering, all designed to ensure that Griffin walked away with everything, while his soon-to-be ex-wife left with nothing. On the other side sat Cassandra Winters. Though she looked small and diminished in the oversized leather chair, she wore a simple gray cardigan from Target that had seen better days, faded jeans that bore the evidence of too many washes, and canvas sneakers that squeaked slightly against the marble floor when she shifted position. Her canvas tote bag, emblazoned with the logo of the Lincoln Park Animal Shelter where she volunteered, sat at her feet like a silent testament to a life Griffin had spent the past 3 years trying to forget. She wore no jewelry, not even the simple gold band he'd given her a decade ago. He'd demanded it back the moment he filed, claiming it was an heirloom. It wasn't. Her lawyer was a harried-looking public defender who'd been assigned to the case pro bono, a man who kept glancing at his watch as though he had 17 other appointments that afternoon, which he probably did. Griffin checked his Rolex with theatrical precision. The reservation at Alinea was for 7 o'clock, and he'd already planned the evening down to the last detail. Champagne with Sienna, celebration, freedom, the beginning of the life he deserved, finally unshackled from the dead weight of a woman who'd never understood ambition. "Come on, Cass. I have a reservation at Alinea at 7. Don't drag this out. You know the prenup is ironclad." His voice carried that particular tone he'd perfected over the years, dismissive, slightly bored, as though her presence was an inconvenience he was graciously tolerating. Cassandra looked up from the papers, her blue eyes tired but strangely clear. There was something in her gaze that gave him pause for just a fraction of a second, something that looked almost like pity. "Are you sure, Griffin? Completely sure about this?" Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but it carried across the room with unexpected weight. Griffin laughed again, louder this time, and Preston Locke allowed himself a small smirk. "Sure? Look at you, Cass. Look at me. I close 7-figure deals. You clip coupons and smell like dog food. We exist in different stratospheres, babe. Frankly, I should have done this 3 years ago, when I realized what a mistake I'd made." He didn't mention Sienna Blake by name, but the affair was an open secret. His executive assistant, 28 years old with legs that went on for days, and an Instagram following that made her feel like a minor celebrity. She'd been flaunting the diamond earrings he'd bought her, charged to the joint account he'd locked Cassandra out of weeks ago, around the office like trophies. Cassandra's hands were folded in her lap, her knuckles white. For a moment, Griffin thought she might cry, might beg, might give him the satisfaction of breaking down. Instead, she simply nodded and reached for the pen Preston slid across the table. The prenuptial agreement they'd signed years ago had been straightforward enough. What's mine stays mine. What's yours stays yours. But last year, Griffin had insisted on an amendment. His lawyers had buried it in legal language so dense that Cassandra's eyes had glazed over when she tried to read it. The critical clause, hidden in subsection 12 of an already impenetrable document, transferred all intellectual property rights from any work created during the marriage. At the time, Griffin had explained it as a formality. Just protecting the company, babe. Standard stuff. You trust me, right? She had trusted him. She'd signed without argument, without question, because a decade ago she'd promised to love and honor him. And back then those words had meant something. What Griffin conveniently forgot, or perhaps had never truly acknowledged, was that Cassandra Winters had built the foundation of his success with her own hands. 10 years earlier, they'd been students at Northwestern. Griffin had been ambitious but broke, full of ideas but lacking the discipline to execute them. Cassandra had been working 2 jobs, waitressing at a diner on the north side during the day, doing bookkeeping for a small accounting firm at night, just to keep them afloat while Griffin pursued his MBA. She'd edited every assignment he turned in, catching the logical fallacies in his arguments, strengthening his prose, teaching him how to construct a compelling business case. His master's thesis, the one that had earned him honors and caught the attention of 3 different firms, had been 80% her work. She'd spent weeks researching market trends, building financial models, crafting the proprietary analysis framework that became the backbone of his entire career. That first deal, the one that had netted him a $500,000 commission and launched his reputation as a rising star, it had been built entirely on a market analysis strategy Cassandra had developed during one of her rare evenings off. She'd been excited to share it with him, had thought they were building something together. Instead, Griffin had taken her work, put his name on it, and presented it to his firm as his own brilliant insight. When the commission check arrived, he'd bought a Mercedes, not to celebrate with her, not to pay off the student loans she'd accumulated supporting him, to impress the senior partners at his firm. That was when things had started to change. Money had a way of revealing character, and Griffin's character, it turned out, was fundamentally hollow. Success fed his ego until there was nothing left but arrogance and entitlement. Cassandra became an embarrassment, a reminder of poverty, of struggle, of a past he wanted to erase. At office parties, he'd introduce her with barely concealed disdain. My wife, well, soon-to-be ex-wife, she volunteers with animals. The implication was always clear. She was beneath him, beneath this world of power lunches and luxury cars and designer suits. The affair with Sienna had started 18 months ago. Griffin hadn't been particularly subtle about it. Charged dinners to the company card, late nights that turned into overnights. Cassandra had known, had said nothing, had simply absorbed each new humiliation with that same quiet grace that Griffin mistook for weakness. Now, watching her sign the divorce papers without a single demand, without asking for alimony or a fair division of assets, without even reading the clauses that stripped her of any claim to the intellectual work she'd created, Griffin felt a surge of vindication. He'd been right all along. She was weak. She was a victim. She'd accepted her role as the discarded wife without so much as a whimper of protest. Done! God, I feel lighter, like dropping 120 pounds of dead weight. Good luck with whatever it is you do, Cassandra. Try not to starve. He stood, buttoning his jacket with a theatrical flourish. Preston Locke gathered the papers with efficient movements, sliding them into a leather portfolio. The public defender was already halfway to the door, muttering something about another appointment. Cassandra stood slowly, carefully placing her copy of the documents into her canvas tote. Then she looked up at Griffin with those clear blue eyes, and for just a moment, he felt something cold slide down his spine. You're right, Griffin. We do exist in different stratospheres. Remember you said that? There was something in her tone, not anger, not bitterness, but something else, something that sounded almost like certainty. Griffin dismissed it immediately. She was probably trying to maintain some dignity in defeat. He waved her off as though swatting at a fly. Yeah, get out of my building, Cassandra. Security will escort you if needed." He was already on his phone before she reached the elevator, his voice loud and celebratory as he dialed Sienna. "It's done, baby. Champagne's on ice. We're celebrating tonight. The dead weight is finally gone." Cassandra pressed the button for the ground floor, her heart maintaining a slow, steady rhythm against her ribs. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, the sixth call from an unknown number with a 212 area code. New York. She ignored it again, letting it go to voicemail. Right now, she had exactly 24 hours to vacate the penthouse in Gold Coast, to pack up what remained of a life she'd spent a decade building, to disappear from the world Griffin Ashford inhabited. The walk from the Willis Tower to the bus stop felt like a marathon. March in Chicago was brutal, the wind whipping off Lake Michigan with enough force to cut through her thin cardigan. She couldn't afford a taxi, and Griffin had already canceled her credit cards. The CTA bus was 40 minutes late, and when it finally arrived, she had to stand in the aisle, pressed between commuters who smelled of coffee and resignation. The penthouse had been Griffin's pride and joy. 4,000 square feet of marble and glass overlooking the city, with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that cost more than most people's cars. It had never felt like a home to Cassandra. It felt like a museum, a carefully curated display of wealth designed to impress visitors and intimidate competitors. She'd spent the past 6 months sleeping in the guest room, exiled from the master suite where Griffin and Sienna conducted their affair with increasingly little discretion. When Cassandra arrived at the building, she found Sienna already there. The younger woman was standing in the living room, wearing a silk bathrobe that Cassandra recognized immediately. Frette, $400, a gift Griffin had given her on their 5th anniversary. Sienna held a glass of Griffin's most expensive champagne, the Dom Perignon he kept in the climate-controlled wine cellar for special occasions. She didn't look surprised to see Cassandra. She looked bored. "Oh, Griffin said you'd be gone by now. We're having guests over tonight. Don't want the help lingering, you know." Her voice dripped with manufactured sweetness, the tone of someone who'd already won and was simply enjoying the victory lap. Cassandra said nothing. She walked past Sienna, past the living room with its uncomfortable designer furniture, past the kitchen with its sub-zero appliances that had barely been used, straight to the guest room where she'd been living like a stranger in her own home. She packed efficiently. One suitcase held her clothes, simple pieces from Target and Old Navy, nothing expensive, nothing that carried Griffin's money. A small box contained her books, mostly novels she'd collected over the years from used bookstores and library sales. And then there was the wooden box, small and battered, that had belonged to her grandmother, Theodora. Grandma Thea had died 3 years ago. She'd spent her final 15 years in a nursing home called Shady Oaks, a modest facility on the south side where the staff was kind but overworked, and the building always smelled faintly of disinfectant and institutional food. Cassandra had visited every Sunday without fail, sitting by her grandmother's bed, reading to her, holding her hand, listening to rambling stories about a youth that seemed impossibly glamorous compared to the antiseptic reality of the nursing home. When Thea died, the only thing she'd left behind was this wooden box. Inside were a few photographs. Thea as a young woman, impossibly beautiful in a way that took Cassandra's breath away, a tarnished silver locket, and a sealed letter in a yellowed envelope with Cassandra's name written in shaky cursive. Cassandra had never opened the letter. Something about the weight of it, the finality, had made her postpone reading it. First, she'd been too busy with the funeral arrangement. Then Griffin had been in the middle of a particularly demanding deal and needed her help with the presentation materials. Then there'd been the affair to ignore, the marriage to try to save, the desperate hope that maybe if she just tried harder, loved better, asked for less, things would go back to how they used to be. Now, kneeling on the floor of the guest room, she slid the wooden box into her suitcase and zipped it closed. Griffin appeared in the doorway, already drunk despite the early hour. His tie was loosened, his shirt partially unbuttoned, and there was a mean glint in his eyes that alcohol always brought out. "Where are you going? Back to your parents' trailer park in Iowa?" Cassandra's parents had died in a car accident when she was 19. They'd lived in a modest farmhouse, not a trailer park, but Griffin had always enjoyed embellishing her background to make it sound worse than it was. His own family was solidly middle class. His father, a dentist, his mother, a school administrator. But he'd spent years rewriting his personal history to sound more impressive. "I'm staying in the city." She kept her voice level, refusing to give him the reaction he wanted. Griffin laughed, wrapping an arm around Sienna's waist and pulling her close. "Doing what? Scrubbing toilets? God, look at her, Sienna. It's pathetic to think I was married to that." Sienna giggled, pressing herself against him, and Cassandra felt something inside her finally, irreversibly break. Not her heart, that had broken months ago, maybe years ago, in small increments that added up to complete destruction. What broke now was the last fragile thread of connection she'd felt to the man she'd once loved. "Goodbye, Griffin." She reached for the wooden box to transfer it to her tote bag, something easier to carry. Griffin moved faster than she expected, his reflexes fueled by alcohol and malice. He snatched the box from her hands, shaking it close to his ear. "What's this? Trying to steal something on your way out? It's my grandmother's. Give it back." The pleading in her voice seemed to energize him. He shook the box harder, hearing something rattle inside. "Sounds like junk. Probably cheap costume jewelry your trailer trash grandmother thought was valuable." He threw it at her. Not handed it back, threw it. The box hit her chest and fell to the floor, the latch breaking open, contents spilling across the hardwood. The photographs scattered. The locket skittered under the dresser. The sealed letter landed face up, Cassandra's name visible in her grandmother's handwriting. "Take your trash and get out. And don't ever contact me again. If I see you anywhere near this building, I'll have you arrested for trespassing." Cassandra dropped to her knees, gathering the scattered items with trembling hands. The photographs were creased now, one of them torn at the corner. The locket had a new dent. She couldn't find all the pieces of the broken box latch. When she finally stood, clutching everything to her chest, Griffin had already turned away, leading Sienna toward the master bedroom, his hand possessive on her waist. The taxi to the Motel 6 on the outskirts of the city took the last of Cassandra's cash reserves. $59 a night was all she could afford with the $400 she'd managed to save by skimming tiny amounts from the grocery budget over the past 6 months. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke, inadequately masked by industrial-strength air freshener and chemical lemon cleaner. The bedspread had stains she tried not to examine too closely. The bathroom had rust around the drain and a shower head that dripped with metronomic persistence. She sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, finally allowing herself to open the wooden box properly, to examine what had survived Griffin's casual cruelty. The photographs, despite their new creases, still showed Grandma Thea in her youth, a woman of startling beauty and elegance, wearing clothes that spoke of wealth Cassandra had never associated with her grandmother's modest life. In one photo, Thea stood in front of what looked like a mansion, her hand resting on the hood of a vintage car that probably cost more than Cassandra had earned in her entire life. In another, she wore a gown that would have been at home on a Hollywood red carpet, diamonds at her throat catching the light. The locket, when Cassandra finally retrieved it from the debris, held two photographs. One showed a younger Thea with a handsome man who wasn't Cassandra's grandfather. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Thomas, the one who loved me for me, the one I was too young to choose." And then there was the letter. Cassandra's hands shook as she broke the seal on the yellowed envelope. The paper inside was expensive, heavy stock that had aged to a soft cream color. The handwriting was shaky but unmistakably her grandmother's. "My dearest Cassandra, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you're finally free. Don't cry, darling. This isn't the end. This is your beginning. Wait for Mr. Pembroke's call. Trust him. Everything I never told you is about to make sense. The wolf has shown his teeth. Now it's time for the lioness to roar. All my love, Grandma Thea. Cassandra read the letter 3 times, trying to extract meaning from the cryptic phrases. Mr. Pembroke? She didn't know anyone by that name. The wolf? Presumably Griffin? And what did any of this have to do with being free? Her phone buzzed again. The same 212 number. 7 missed calls now. With trembling fingers, she finally answered. Miss Winters? The voice was male, deep, with the kind of cultured accent that spoke of Ivy League education in old money. This is she. My name is Alistair Pembroke. I'm an estate attorney from Manhattan. I'm calling regarding your grandmother, Theodora Winters. I have news that will change your life, Miss Winters. I need you to come to New York immediately. Cassandra's first thought was debt. Her grandmother had died with medical bills that Cassandra had been paying off in small increments for 3 years. Perhaps there were more hidden obligations that were now coming due. I don't have money for bills right now. If this is about, it's not about bills. It's about your inheritance. There's a car waiting outside your motel. I've arranged a private flight from Chicago to New York. We need to speak in person. Cassandra walked to the window, pulling aside the thin curtain that did little to block the light from the parking lot. Sure enough, a black Cadillac Escalade sat idling near the motel office, incongruous among the aging sedans and pickup trucks that made up most of the lot. The vehicle's windows were tinted, its chrome gleaming even under the harsh fluorescent lights. How did you know where I am? I've been tracking you since the divorce was finalized this afternoon. Please, Miss Winters, your grandmother left very specific instructions. Time is of the essence. The flight from Chicago to New York was Cassandra's first experience with private aviation. The Gulfstream G650 waiting at a private terminal at O'Hare was larger than her studio apartment back when she and Griffin were first married. The interior was all cream leather and polished wood, with seats that reclined into beds, and a flight attendant who offered her champagne that probably cost more than the Motel 6 room she just left. Cassandra didn't touch the champagne. She sat in one of the massive seats, her canvas tote clutched in her lap, watching the clouds through windows that seemed impossibly large. Her mind couldn't reconcile any of this with the grandmother she'd known, the woman who'd lived in a nursing home, who'd worn the same 3 dresses in rotation, who'd been so careful with money that she'd saved the plastic containers from her cafeteria meals to reuse. The flight took just over 2 hours. When they landed at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, another Cadillac was waiting, this one even more luxurious than the first. The man who stood beside it was tall and distinguished, his silver hair perfectly styled, his suit custom-tailored in a way that made Griffin's expensive wardrobe look gauche by comparison. Miss Winters, Alistair Pembroke. He extended his hand and Cassandra shook it, noting the firmness of his grip, the calluses that spoke of someone who played tennis or golf regularly. Welcome to your real life. They drove into Manhattan, and Cassandra watched the city unfold outside the windows. The gleaming towers, the crowds, the energy that made Chicago feel provincial by comparison. But they didn't stop at a hotel. Instead, the car pulled up to a limestone townhouse on the Upper East Side, a 5-story fortress of old money surrounded by a wrought iron fence and discreet security cameras. The staff was lined up inside, a butler named Winston who looked like he'd stepped out of a period drama, a housekeeper named Martha Reed whose kind eyes immediately put Cassandra at ease, and a chef named Garrett who nodded respectfully as she was introduced. They stood in the marble-floored foyer as though this were normal, as though the arrival of a woman in a Target cardigan was exactly what they'd been expecting. What is this? Who are you people? Cassandra's voice cracked on the last word, exhaustion and confusion finally overwhelming her ability to maintain composure. We've been waiting for you for 15 years, Miss Winters, since the day your grandmother entered Shady Oaks nursing home. Please, come with me. Alistair led her through the townhouse, past rooms furnished with antiques and artwork that even Cassandra's untrained eye could recognize as valuable. They ended up in a library on the second floor, a room that smelled of old leather and beeswax, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and windows that looked out over a private garden. He placed a thick leather binder on the mahogany desk, opening it to reveal documents, photographs, and what looked like financial statements. Your grandmother was Theodora Winters Carrington. Does that name mean anything to you? Cassandra shook her head, too overwhelmed to speak. Carrington Industries, steel and shipping. The family that built half of Chicago's skyline in the 1960s? Recognition flickered. She'd seen that name on buildings, on historical plaques, in newspaper archives when she'd been researching Chicago's industrial history for one of Griffin's presentations. Your grandmother was the sole heir to the Carrington fortune. When your grandfather died in 1985, she inherited everything. Approximately $4.2 billion in assets, holdings, and investments. The number was so large it didn't seem real. Cassandra laughed, a short, sharp sound that bordered on hysteria. My grandmother lived in a nursing home. She ate cafeteria food. She wore the same 3 dresses. She saved plastic containers. She did all of that deliberately. Your grandmother hated the attention that wealth brought. She hated the vultures, the hangers-on, the people who pretended to care about her when all they wanted was access to her money. So she did something extraordinary. She created a trust, placed all her assets into it, and disappeared into a modest life where she could be certain that the people who loved her did so for the right reasons. Alistair turned pages in the binder, showing Cassandra financial statements, property deeds, stock certificates. The Winters Legacy Trust owned 40% of the commercial real estate in downtown Chicago. It held majority shares in 15 different companies. There was an art collection valued at over $200 million, stored in climate-controlled facilities around the country. And then there were the properties, this townhouse, a ranch in Montana, a beach house in the Carolinas, an apartment in San Francisco. But there was a condition to your inheritance. Your grandmother was very specific. You could only receive these assets after you were free from what she called the parasitic attachment. She had private investigators tracking Mr. Ashford for 5 years. She knew about the affair, she knew about the way he treated you, and she was waiting for you to see him clearly, to choose to leave him of your own volition. Cassandra felt tears streaming down her face, though she couldn't remember when she'd started crying. She was there all those years, watching me struggle, watching me work 2 jobs to put him through school. Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she help? Alistair's expression softened with something that looked like sympathy. Because she loved you, Miss Winters. She wanted you to build your own strength. Money doesn't make you strong. Surviving does. Overcoming does. And now you're unbreakable. He pulled out another document, this one a letter in Thea's handwriting, longer and more detailed than the note Cassandra had found in the wooden box. Cassandra's hands trembled as she unfolded the second letter, the paper crackling with age despite the careful preservation. The handwriting was shakier than the first note, as though Thea had written this during one of her worst days, when arthritis made every word a battle. My dearest Cassandra, if you're reading this, the wolf is finally gone. I know you're heartbroken, darling. You think you've lost everything, but sweet girl, you haven't lost. You've been pruned. Sometimes a gardener must cut away the dead branches so the tree can grow toward the sun. I didn't give you money before because he would have taken it. Griffin Ashford would have spent every penny, left you anyway, or worse, stayed with you only for the wealth, and you would never have known his true character. I needed you to see him as he really is, a hollow man, a thief dressed in expensive suits. Yes, my love, a thief. I had investigators document everything, every business proposal you wrote that he claimed as his own. Every strategy you developed that he presented to his firm. Every late night you spent building the foundation of his success while he slept, oblivious or uncaring. 10 years of intellectual labor, stolen and repackaged as masculine genius. Now that you know you're ready to wield the sword, everything is yours. The properties, the stocks, the art collection. And yes, darling, the majority shareholder position in the Winters Legacy Trust, which owns the commercial mortgage on the building where Ashford Strategic Group operates. You are his landlord. You are his bank. You are the sky falling on his arrogant head. But Cassandra, listen to me carefully. Don't just destroy him. That's easy. That's what a small person would do. What he would do in your position. You're better than that. You're a Winters. You're a Carrington. You're a lioness. Be strategic. Be patient. Let his own arrogance be his downfall. And when he finally falls, make certain he understands exactly why. All my love, all my pride. Grandma, Thea. Alistair waited while Cassandra read, his expression unreadable. When she finally looked up, her face was wet with tears, but her eyes had changed. Something had shifted behind them, a transformation that Alistair had seen before in people who'd suddenly understood their own power. There's more. Something your grandmother wanted you to know immediately. He pulled another document from the binder, this one a photocopy of the prenuptial agreement she'd signed with Griffin. Sections were highlighted in yellow, particularly the clause about intellectual property that had seemed so innocuous at the time. When Mr. Ashford added this amendment last year, he thought he was protecting himself, ensuring that if you ever tried to claim credit for your work, he'd have legal documentation of ownership. What he didn't realize is that this document is actually a confession. Cassandra stared at the highlighted text, her mind slowly processing the implications. Our forensic accountants have been building a case for 18 months. Every email you sent with attachments, every Google Doc where track changes show your authorship, every timestamp proving you were working at 2 in the morning while he was asleep. We have 47 business proposals where you were the primary author, 23 pitch decks you created from scratch, 15 financial models that bear your unique analytical framework. And we have his name on every single one of them, presented to clients and partners as his original work. Intellectual property theft. The words felt heavy in Cassandra's mouth, tasting of betrayal and vindication in equal measure. On a massive scale, and by signing this prenuptial agreement, by claiming ownership of all intellectual property created during your marriage, he's essentially admitted that he knew these materials existed and considered them valuable enough to legally appropriate them. Any competent attorney could argue this as evidence of knowing theft. But why would he sign something that incriminates him? Because he's arrogant. He assumed you'd never fight back, never hire a lawyer good enough to see the trap he'd set for himself. He thought he was so clever, covering all his bases. Instead, he built his own cage. Alistair closed the binder with a decisive snap. The Ashford Strategic Group currently owes $45 million to the Winters Legacy Trust. The loan is 90 days past due. Technically, you could call it in tomorrow. The firm would collapse within a week. Mr. Ashford's equity stake, his entire net worth, would be reduced to zero. Cassandra stood abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the private garden. Spring was just beginning to assert itself in New York. Early crocuses pushing through the soil, trees showing the first hint of green. Outside, the city hummed with energy and ambition, and the kind of ruthless competition that Griffin had always claimed to thrive on. Number. Bankruptcy is too fast. I want him to feel it. Every single day, every moment. I want him to understand what he took from me. Then we'll need a strategy. And we'll need to move quickly. The firm has requested a meeting with the new leadership of Winters Legacy Trust. They think they're meeting with some faceless corporate entity they can charm or manipulate. They have no idea who actually owns their debt. When is the meeting? 8 weeks from yesterday. Your divorce was finalized on a Friday. They've scheduled the review for 8 weeks later, which gives us time to prepare, but not so much time that they'll have found alternative financing. Cassandra turned back from the window, and Alistair saw the woman she was becoming. Not yet fully formed, still wrapped in grief and exhaustion, and the target cardigan that represented a life she was leaving behind. But the foundation was there, the steel. I want to attend that meeting. I want to be the one sitting at the head of their conference table when they walk in, expecting to negotiate with someone who doesn't know what Griffin Ashford really is. Then we have work to do. The next 6 weeks became a crucible that transformed Cassandra Winters from a woman who'd been systematically diminished into someone who could walk into a boardroom and command absolute attention. Alistair assembled a team with the efficiency of a general preparing for war. Morgan Vale arrived first, a 30-year-old executive assistant whose sharp intelligence was matched only by her ability to anticipate needs before they were articulated. She'd worked for 3 different Fortune 500 CEOs before Alistair recruited her specifically for this assignment. Your schedule for the next 6 weeks is going to be brutal. 16-hour days minimum. You'll be learning everything about your companies, about corporate governance, about the art of strategic demolition disguised as business as usual. Morgan's voice was brisk, but not unkind, and Cassandra found herself trusting the younger woman almost immediately. Ethan Cross came next, a forensic accountant whose specialty was untangling complex financial fraud. He spread documents across the library table, each one representing a different thread in the tapestry of Griffin's deception. This is the Miller Group deal. Your husband, ex-husband, claimed credit for a market penetration strategy that increased their revenue by 38%. But look at these timestamps. He pulled up a laptop screen showing Google Docs revision history. Cassandra's user account showed as the creator, with detailed edits and additions spanning 3 weeks of work. Griffin's account showed a single action, changing the author name to his own. He did this 47 times that we can document. 47 separate instances where he took your work and represented it as his own intellectual creation. In most states, this would constitute theft of trade secrets. The fact that you were married doesn't change the legal implications. It actually makes it worse, because he was in a position of trust. Cassandra watched the evidence compile, each document another weight on the scale of justice she was building. What about the firm's current situation? Are they actually in financial trouble? Or is this just about the overdue loan? Ethan pulled up a different spreadsheet, this one showing revenue projections versus actual performance. They're hemorrhaging clients. 3 major accounts have threatened to leave in the past 6 months, all citing unprofessional conduct by senior leadership, which means Griffin. He's been billing extravagant dinners and entertainment to client accounts, making inappropriate comments, showing up drunk to meetings. The firm's reputation is suffering, and the other partners are getting nervous. So even without the loan being called, they're in trouble. They're in significant trouble. The loan is just the mechanism that gives you leverage. What you choose to do with that leverage, that's where strategy comes in. Dr. Vivian Sterling was perhaps the most important addition to the team, though Cassandra didn't understand that immediately. The therapist came recommended by Alistair, who'd simply said that anyone going through this kind of transformation needed psychological support to navigate the emotional complexity. Their first session happened in the townhouse library, late on a Tuesday evening after Cassandra had spent 14 hours studying corporate governance structures and practicing her executive presence with a consultant who'd worked with everyone from tech CEOs to political candidates. You're angry, that's clear, but I want you to think about what you actually want from this situation. Dr. Sterling's voice was calm, clinical, creating a space where honesty felt possible. I want him to hurt. I want him to feel what I felt when he threw my grandmother's box at my chest, when he laughed at me, when he told me I smelled like dog food. The words came out in a rush, and Cassandra was surprised by the venom in her own voice. And after he hurts, after he's humbled and broken and knows exactly what he lost, what then? The question landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward. Cassandra sat in silence for a long moment, examining the truth of what she wanted. I don't want to destroy him completely. I want him to learn, to understand, to carry the knowledge of what he did for the rest of his life and be better because of it. That's the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge is about making someone suffer. Justice is about restoring balance and creating the possibility for growth, even if that growth is painful. Is it wrong that I want both? I want him to suffer, and I want him to learn? No, it's human. But if you're going to do this, if you're going to walk into that boardroom and dismantle his world piece by piece, you need to be clear about your boundaries. How far are you willing to go? At what point does justified consequence become cruelty? Cassandra thought about Griffin throwing her belongings into garbage bags, about Sienna wearing her bathrobe, about 10 years of her life stolen and repackaged as masculine achievement. I want him to lose his job. I want him to face the consequences of his theft. I want him to understand that actions have repercussions, but I don't want to destroy his ability to rebuild. I'm not trying to make him homeless or ruin him forever. I'm trying to reset the balance. Then that's your North Star. When you're making decisions in that boardroom, when you're watching him realize what's happening, that's the principle you hold on to. Controlled justice, not unlimited revenge. The physical transformation was less important than the psychological one, but it served a purpose. Cassandra sat in a chair at an upscale salon in Soho, while a stylist named Jean-Paul examined her hair with the intensity of a sculptor studying marble. We're not trying to make you look like someone you're not. We're revealing who you actually are. You've been hiding behind this appearance because it made you invisible, made you safe. Now we need you visible. We need you formidable. The long brown hair she'd worn in a perpetual ponytail was transformed into a sharp bob. The color deepened to a rich auburn that brought out the gold flecks in her blue eyes. The cheap drugstore makeup was replaced with a lesson in executive presence. How to use cosmetics not as decoration, but as armor. You want people to see intelligence first, competence second, beauty third. In that order. So we keep the look clean, professional, with just enough edge to signal that you're not someone to underestimate. The wardrobe consultant, a woman named Patricia who dressed 3 different gubernatorial candidates, took one look at Cassandra's Target cardigan and promptly threw it away. We're building a power wardrobe, not a costume. Everything you wear needs to communicate authority, intelligence, and the absolute certainty that you belong in any room you enter. The suits were American designers, Michael Kors, Ralph Lauren, Carolina Herrera. Nothing ostentatious, nothing that screamed new money. Every piece was tailored to perfection, cut to emphasize Cassandra's height and the strength in her shoulders that came from years of physical labor. When you walk into that boardroom, you need to look like you were born to be there. Like this is your natural habitat and everyone else is a guest. The final 2 weeks compressed everything into razor-sharp focus. Week 7 was spent in pure simulation mode, Morgan playing not just Griffin, but every possible variation of him. The charming Griffin who'd try to leverage their shared history, the angry Griffin who'd attempt intimidation, the desperate Griffin who'd beg for mercy they both knew he didn't deserve. You need to be ready for whichever version walks through that door, or all 3 in succession. Morgan was relentless, pushing every emotional button, trying every manipulation tactic Griffin had ever used. And slowly, painfully, Cassandra learned to stay centered, regardless of which mask he wore. By week 8, the final days before the meeting, Cassandra had internalized the strategy until it felt like breathing rather than performance. She could recite the financial discrepancies without notes. She could navigate the intellectual property evidence with surgical precision. And most importantly, she could sit across from the man who'd stolen 10 years of her life and feel nothing but calm, clear purpose. The night before the meeting, Dr. Sterling asked her one final question in their session. Tomorrow, When you walk into that room and he sees you for the first time as someone with power, what do you want him to feel? Cassandra considered this carefully, examining her motivations with the honesty that months of therapy had built. I want him to feel what I felt when he threw my grandmother's box at my chest. Not the specific humiliation, but the understanding. The sudden, complete realization that he'd been wrong about everything. That's not cruelty. That's consequence. That's justice. Exactly. But the most important transformation was the one that happened in the hours Cassandra spent with Morgan Vale, learning to inhabit her new role as CEO of the Winters Legacy Trust. They started with the basics: how to read a balance sheet, how to interpret cash flow statements, how to ask the kinds of questions that revealed whether executives were being honest or trying to hide problems. You don't need to be the smartest person in the room. You need to be the most informed and the most willing to ask uncomfortable questions. Smart people can be intimidated into silence. Powerful people can't. Morgan set up practice scenarios, role-playing different boardroom situations. Cassandra learned how to modulate her voice for maximum impact, how to use silence as a weapon, how to deliver devastating critiques with the kind of calm professionalism that made them impossible to dismiss as emotional or personal. When Griffin walks into that room, he's going to try to use your history together as leverage. He'll try to make this personal, to embarrass you, to make the other people in the room uncomfortable with the intimacy of your shared past. You need to be ready for that. How do I counter it? By refusing to engage on his terms. Every time he tries to make it about your marriage, you redirect to the business issue at hand. Every time he tries to use emotion, you respond with data. You don't defend yourself. You don't justify. You just keep steering the conversation back to his failures as a professional. They practice for hours, Morgan playing Griffin with uncanny accuracy, pushing every button, trying every manipulation tactic. And slowly, painfully, Cassandra learned to stay centered, to respond rather than react, to wield her power with precision rather than rage. The investigation into Griffin's professional conduct revealed more than Cassandra had expected. Ethan Cross had subpoenaed records from the past 5 years, and what emerged was a pattern of increasingly reckless behavior. The Miller Group situation was even worse than the preliminary reports suggested. Your ex-husband took James Miller to a club in River North, ran up a $4,800 tab, then proceeded to critique Miller's wife's appearance loud enough for other patrons to hear. Miller filed a formal complaint with Ashford Strategic's HR department the following Monday. Someone buried it. Who buried it? Ethan pulled up an email chain that showed the complaint being forwarded to Griffin, then to someone named Sienna Blake, then disappearing from the official record. His assistant, who is also his mistress. She has access to the HR system and used it to delete complaints before they could reach the partners. That's obstruction. That's covering up misconduct. It's also documentation that Griffin knew his behavior was problematic and took active steps to hide it rather than correct it, which undermines any claim that he was acting in good faith or simply made an error in judgment. The evidence compiled over 6 weeks painted a picture of a man whose success was built on stolen intellectual property and whose decline was entirely self-inflicted. Griffin had spent so many years believing his own mythology that he'd stopped putting in actual work. He'd relied on Cassandra's invisible labor for so long that when she was gone, he had no foundation to stand on. His most recent pitch deck for the Vantage Tech account was a disaster. Morgan pulled it up on her laptop, and Cassandra could see immediately what was wrong. The strategy was incoherent. The financial projections were wildly optimistic without supporting data, and the whole presentation lacked the logical flow that had been her signature. He's lost without you. He just doesn't know it yet. The partners at Ashford Strategic Group had scheduled the Winters Legacy Trust meeting for a Wednesday morning in mid-May, exactly 8 weeks after Cassandra's divorce was finalized. The firm occupied floors 32 through 35 of a building in the Loop, with sweeping views of Lake Michigan and enough glass and chrome to signal ambition and modernity. Griffin had been preparing for this meeting with the kind of confidence that came from never having faced real consequences. He told the other partners that this was a formality, that the new owners of Winter's Legacy were probably some hedge fund managers who could be charmed into better terms with the right combination of flattery and expensive whiskey. Wade Carrington, the senior partner who'd built the firm from nothing 30 years earlier, was less sanguine. "This isn't some routine review, Griffin. We're 90 days past due on a $45 million loan. The new leadership specifically requested this meeting. That's not standard procedure. That's someone taking an active interest in our situation." Griffin had waved off the concern, polishing his pitch about the firm's future prospects, planning which suit to wear, even buying a $3,000 bottle of Pappy Van Winkle bourbon to present as a gift. In his mind, this was just another deal to close, another room full of people to impress. He had no idea that the woman he'd divorced 8 weeks earlier had spent every day since then preparing to dismantle the empire he'd built on her stolen work. The morning of the meeting, Cassandra stood in front of the full-length mirror in the master bedroom of the townhouse, examining the woman who looked back at her. The white Michael Kors suit was severe and elegant, cut with military precision. The burgundy heels added 3 inches to her height, making her nearly 6 feet tall. The sapphire necklace that had belonged to Grandma Thea rested against her collarbones, insured for $2.1 million and worth every penny for the confidence it provided. Morgan Vale stood behind her, making final adjustments to the collar of the suit jacket. "Remember, you walk in like you own the building, because you do. You sit at the head of the table, because you're the chairwoman, and you let them come to you. Don't engage with Griffin's attempts to make this personal. Just keep redirecting to the business failures that brought us to this moment." Cassandra nodded, her reflection nodding back. She looked like power. She looked like money. She looked like someone who'd been born into boardrooms and corner offices, not someone who'd scrubbed floors and waited tables to put her husband through business school. The Cadillac that took them to the meeting was the same one that had picked her up from the Motel 6 8 weeks earlier. Winston drove with the smooth competence of someone who'd been navigating city traffic for decades, getting them to the building with 15 minutes to spare. Alistair and Morgan flanked her as they entered the lobby, their presence a silent statement that she didn't travel alone, that she had resources and support and the kind of institutional backing that made casual dismissal impossible. The security guards at the front desk did a double take when they saw the 3 of them. Alistair in his perfectly tailored suit, Morgan in a charcoal dress that screamed executive assistant to someone important, and Cassandra herself radiating the kind of quiet power that made people straighten their posture and speak more carefully. "We're here for the Winter's Legacy Trust meeting with Ashford Strategic Group." The guard checked his list, then gestured toward the elevator bank. 34th floor, conference room A. The elevator ride felt both endless and instantaneous. Cassandra watched the numbers climb, feeling her heart rate slow rather than accelerate. This was the moment everything had been building toward. 8 weeks of preparation, 10 years of stolen credit, a lifetime of being underestimated. The doors opened onto a sleek reception area where a young woman sat behind a curved desk, her expression professional but curious. "Ms. Winters? They're waiting for you in the main conference room. Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee?" "We're fine, thank you." Cassandra's voice was steady, betraying none of the electricity that ran through her veins. The receptionist stood, preparing to escort them, but Alistair shook his head. "We know the way." They walked down a corridor lined with photographs of the firm's major deals, smiling partners shaking hands with clients, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, and groundbreakings. Griffin appeared in at least a dozen of these photos, his face younger in the earlier ones, more arrogant in the recent shots. The conference room was exactly as Cassandra had imagined it would be. Glass walls, mahogany table, leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. And there, standing by the window with his back to the door, was Griffin Ashford. He wore a new suit, probably bought specifically for this meeting, and his posture radiated the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of rooms rearranging themselves around his presence. Wade Carrington sat at the table looking nervous. Preston Locke, Griffin's divorce attorney, was there as well, which struck Cassandra as odd, until she realized he probably served as general counsel for the firm. And in the corner, trying to look professional, but mostly looking out of place, was Sienna Blake. Griffin turned when he heard footsteps, his winning smile already in place. He'd probably practiced that smile in the mirror, the same way he practiced everything else that was designed to charm and manipulate. The smile froze when he saw who was walking through the door. The two security guards who'd accompanied them from the townhouse entered first, taking positions on either side of the doorway. Then Alistair Pembroke, carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Griffin's car. Then Morgan Vale, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes taking in every detail of the room. And finally, Cassandra. She didn't look at Griffin immediately. She walked past him as though he were part of the furniture, her heels clicking against the floor with metronomic precision. She set her custom leather briefcase on the table at the head, not the side, the head, and slowly unbuttoned her suit jacket before sitting down. Only then did she raise her eyes to meet his. "Good morning, gentlemen. Shall we discuss your overdue account?" Her voice was different from the one Griffin remembered, lower, more controlled, with the kind of measured cadence that suggested every word had been chosen with purpose. This wasn't the woman who'd cried quietly in the guest room. This wasn't the wife who'd absorbed his cruelty with downcast eyes and trembling hands. This was someone else entirely. Griffin's face had gone through several colors in rapid succession: pale shock, red confusion, purple rage. His mouth opened and closed without sound, and Cassandra felt a small, dark satisfaction at having broken his legendary composure. "Cass, what the hell are you doing here? How did you even get past security?" His voice cracked on her name, all his practiced charm evaporating in the face of this impossible situation. Wade Carrington had half risen from his chair, looking between Griffin and Cassandra with growing alarm. Alistair answered before Cassandra could, his tone professionally icy. "Mr. Ashford, you are addressing the Chief Executive Officer of Winters Legacy Trust, the entity that currently holds your firm's $45 million credit facility. I suggest you sit down and adopt a more professional tone. This is insane. She's my ex-wife. This is a conflict of interest. Wade, call security and get these people out of..." Griffin was moving toward the phone on the conference table, but Preston Locke caught his arm, whispering something urgent that Cassandra couldn't quite hear. Whatever it was made Griffin stop, though his face remained flushed with anger. "Mr. Ashford, sit down." Alistair's voice could have frozen Lake Michigan. Griffin, perhaps recognizing that he was operating without a script for the first time in years, slowly lowered himself into a chair. Wade Carrington was still standing, looking like he was calculating the fastest route to retirement. Preston Locke cleared his throat, his professional composure straining. "I apologize, but I need to recuse myself from this meeting. Winters Legacy Trust retained my firm this morning. There's a conflict of interest with my representing Ashford Strategic in these proceedings." "You son of a..." Griffin's curse was cut off by Wade's hand on his shoulder, a warning gesture that looked more like a threat. Cassandra opened the leather portfolio in front of her with deliberate slowness, giving Griffin time to absorb each new shock. Alistair and Morgan took seats on either side of her, creating a wall of professional competence that made the three people on the opposite side of the table look disorganized and desperate by comparison. "Gentlemen, Winters Legacy Trust has reviewed your request for a loan extension and additional credit. Before we make any decisions, I'd like to address some discrepancies in your financial reporting." She slid the first document across the table toward Wade. It was a comparison chart showing the client retention figures that Griffin had reported to the partners versus the actual status of those accounts. Mr. Carrington, can you confirm that these are the numbers your firm has been using for internal planning and projections? Wade studied the document, his expression growing more troubled with each line. Yes, these match what we've been told. Griffin assured us that all major accounts were solid and interesting, because our due diligence tells a different story. Cassandra pulled out 3 separate files, each one representing a major client, the Miller Group. Your reports show them as a secured renewal for 3 years. The reality is that James Miller filed a formal complaint about professional misconduct on March 18th. The complaint alleged that Mr. Ashford made inappropriate comments about his wife, consumed alcohol to the point of intoxication during a business dinner, and created a hostile environment. That complaint was suppressed before it reached senior leadership. She looked directly at Sienna, whose face had gone the color of old snow. The complaint was forwarded to Miss Blake, who used her access to the HR system to delete it. We have the metadata showing exactly when the file was removed and who removed it. Wade turned to look at Griffin with an expression that suggested decades of partnership were disintegrating in real time. You told me Miller was happy. You said the renewal was guaranteed. Griffin's jaw worked, but no words came out. His legendary ability to talk his way out of problems had apparently deserted him. Cassandra continued, her voice never rising, never betraying emotion. This was surgery, not assault. O'Connell Logistics, reported as a strong renewal candidate, actually filed a letter of intent to terminate their contract last month, citing concerns about the firm's professionalism and the quality of strategic advice. The letter specifically mentions presentations that lacked coherent analysis and financial projections that weren't supported by data. She pulled up a comparison on the laptop Morgan had set up, showing 2 versions of a pitch deck side by side. One was elegant, logical, with clear data supporting each claim. The other was a mess of buzzwords and unsupported assertions. This is the pitch deck O'Connell received 6 years ago when they first became a client. Note the analytical framework, the proprietary market analysis, the coherent strategy. And this is what they received 3 months ago. Notice the decline in quality? The difference was stark enough that even someone without business training could see it. Wade stared at the screen, his face aging 10 years in 10 seconds. But the real issue we need to discuss isn't client retention, it's intellectual property. Cassandra's voice dropped lower, taking on an edge that made everyone in the room unconsciously lean forward. For the past 10 years, this firm has been using a proprietary analytical framework as the foundation for its client work. That framework appears in virtually every pitch, every proposal, every strategic recommendation you've delivered. Mr. Ashford has taken credit for developing this framework. He's built his reputation on it. She paused, letting the tension build. The problem is that Mr. Ashford didn't develop that framework. I did. Griffin finally found his voice, though it came out strangled. That's ridiculous. You were my wife. You helped me, sure, but helped you? Let's look at the evidence. Ethan Cross, who'd been sitting quietly behind the main group, now came forward with a laptop and projector. Within seconds, the wall screen was showing Google Docs revision history, email threads, file timestamps, 47 business proposals. In every case, the original author was Cassandra Winters. In every case, track changes show her creating the content, developing the analysis, building the strategy. And in every case, the final step before delivery was Mr. Ashford changing the author name to his own. The screen cycled through example after example. Cassandra's late-night edits, her detailed comments and revisions, the timestamps showing her working at 2 and 3 in the morning while Griffin slept. And then, like clockwork, Griffin's account making a single change, replacing her name with his. This is your MBA thesis, Mr. Ashford, the one that earned you honors at Northwestern. 83% of the content was written by Cassandra Winters. We have the original files, the edit history, and testimony from 3 of your former classmates confirming that you regularly submitted her work as your own. The screen showed a plagiarism detection report, red lines connecting passages from Cassandra's drafts to the supposedly original thesis Griffin had submitted. And this is the Miller Group deal, the one that made your reputation, the market penetration strategy that increased their revenue by 38%. Every word of the original analysis was written by Cassandra Winters 3 weeks before you presented it as your breakthrough insight. Wade Carrington had gone very still, the kind of stillness that preceded volcanic eruptions. Preston Locke was already edging toward the door, recognizing the legal catastrophe unfolding in front of him. This is intellectual property theft on a massive scale. 10 years of uncredited labor, 10 years of work stolen and repackaged as masculine genius. And 2 months ago, Mr. Ashford signed a legal document claiming ownership of all this intellectual property. She pulled out the prenuptial agreement, the clause highlighted in yellow. By adding this clause to our divorce settlement, by explicitly claiming these materials as his own creation, Mr. Ashford has provided written evidence of knowing theft. He acknowledged the work existed, he acknowledged its value, and he formally appropriated it as his own. The room had gone completely silent, except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning. Griffin looked like he was trying to remember how to breathe. So here's the situation, gentlemen. Your firm is built on stolen intellectual property. Your lead producer has been systematically lying about client relationships, suppressing complaints, and billing excessive entertainment expenses while providing declining quality of work. Your firm is 90 days overdue on a $45 million loan and has been consistently misrepresenting your financial position to your creditors. Cassandra leaned back in her chair, the picture of relaxed confidence. Winters Legacy Trust is prepared to extend your credit line. We're prepared to inject $50 million in fresh capital to stabilize your operations and rebuild client relationships. We believe this firm has value and can be salvaged. She paused, watching hope flicker in Wade's eyes. But we don't believe in the current leadership. Our condition for the capital injection is simple: the immediate termination, for cause, of Griffin Ashford and Sienna Blake. Mr. Ashford for intellectual property theft, fraud, and misrepresentation. Miss Blake for obstruction and destruction of corporate records. In exchange, we'll restructure your debt at 2% interest instead of 7%. That's $2.25 million in annual savings. The firm survives. Mr. Ashford does not. Griffin exploded out of his chair, his face purple with rage. You can't do this. Wade, we've been partners for 10 years. You're going to let this bitter woman destroy everything because she couldn't handle the divorce? Wade didn't look at him. He was staring at the evidence on the screen, at the email trails and revision histories and timestamps that painted an undeniable picture. Hand over your badge and your phone, Griffin. The words came out flat, emotionless, the sound of a man cutting away gangrenous tissue to save the body. What? No. I built this firm. I brought in 80% of our revenue. You can't just... You stole 80% of our methodology. You lied about client relationships. You exposed us to legal liability that could destroy everything we built. Badge and phone. Now. Security was already moving into the room. The 2 men who'd accompanied Cassandra, now flanked by building security, who'd been quietly summoned by Preston Locke's frantic text messages. This isn't over. I'll sue. I'll sue the firm. I'll sue you, Cassandra. I'll take half of whatever you stole from... Griffin's voice was getting higher, more desperate, the polish cracking to reveal panic underneath. One of the security guards took his arm, not roughly but with unmistakable firmness. You already signed the divorce agreement, Mr. Ashford. You waived all rights to my assets, present and future. And since I inherited the Winters Legacy Trust after our marriage was dissolved, you have no claim to any of it. You wanted a clean break. You got one. Her voice was glacier cold, each word precisely enunciated. This was the moment she'd been building toward for 8 weeks, and she wasn't going to rush it. The guards were pulling Griffin toward the door now, his protests echoing down the hallway as they removed him from the building. Sienna had gone completely silent, frozen in her chair, probably calculating her own exposure. Ms. Blake, you have two options. Sign a resignation letter right now, leave quietly, and we won't pursue criminal charges for obstruction of justice and destruction of corporate records. Or refuse, and I call the Chicago Police Department and press charges for embezzlement and fraud based on the $38,000 in personal purchases you charged to corporate accounts. Sienna's hands shook as she reached for the pen Morgan slid across the table. The resignation letter was already prepared, already notarized, needing only her signature. 30 seconds, Miss Blake. Sienna signed. The sidewalk outside the Willis Tower was a wind tunnel of Chicago spring air, carrying the smell of Lake Michigan and car exhaust in equal measure. Griffin Ashford stood on the concrete with a cardboard box clutched against his chest, containing the sum total of a decade-long career. A silver stapler, a framed photograph of himself shaking hands with a minor tech CEO, a stress ball shaped like a golf ball, and the bottle of Pappy Van Winkle he'd brought to impress people who now wouldn't take his calls. The glass doors hissed shut behind him, sealing him out of the climate-controlled kingdom he'd ruled for so long. The lease had been in the company's name, and Wade had wasted no time canceling it, along with Griffin's corporate credit cards, his building access, his company email. 10 years of partnership dissolved in the time it took to ride an elevator down 34 floors. Griffin pulled out his personal phone with shaking hands and dialed Sienna. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. He tried again. Same result. But we can get through this. We're a team. You said, I said a lot of things when you had money and a corner office. You're broke now, and I don't date broke men. Lose my number. The line went dead. Griffin stared at his phone screen, watching the call timer blink out, trying to understand how his life had imploded in the space of 30 minutes. He tried calling back. Blocked. He tried texting. The message turned green, undelivered. A group of junior associates from his former firm emerged from the building, laughing about something, their suits sharp and their futures bright. One of them glanced at Griffin, recognition flickering across his face, then quickly looked away. They walked past him without acknowledgement, and Griffin heard one of them whisper to another, "That's the guy who got destroyed by his ex-wife. Heard she owns the whole building now." The humiliation burned hotter than the anger. The realization hit him with physical force. He, Griffin Ashford, who'd routinely dropped $300 on lunch, couldn't afford a $15 taxi ride. He picked up the cardboard box and walked to the nearest CTA station, fumbling for the Venture card he hadn't used in 5 years, riding the blue line for the first time since business school. The penthouse in Gold Coast was exactly as he'd left it that morning, sleek, expensive, and utterly empty of human warmth. But when personal belongings have been packed and are available for pickup at the service entrance. Griffin's hand started shaking so badly he dropped the cardboard box. It hit the marble floor with a crash, the framed photograph's glass shattering. He barely noticed. The lease had been in the company's name because it was a corporate apartment, a perk for senior partners. Wade must have canceled it within minutes of the termination, which meant Cassandra now owned this building too, which meant she'd planned every single step of his destruction with surgical precision. The service entrance was around the back of the building, down a ramp that delivery trucks used to access the loading docks. Griffin found his belongings there. 4 black garbage bags stuffed with clothes, shoes, toiletries, and the detritus of a life lived without any thought of eventual scarcity. To Jerry, Griffin was just another tenant being evicted, another problem to be processed and removed. Where am I supposed to take them? I don't have a car. I don't have anywhere to... The words died in Griffin's throat as he realized how pathetic they sounded. Jerry shrugged. Not my problem, sir. You've got 55 minutes now. Griffin called an Uber, the cheapest option available, and the driver looked less than thrilled about loading 4 garbage bags that smelled of expensive cologne in desperation. The ride cost $43, and Griffin watched his bank balance drop below 200 with the kind of sick fascination usually reserved for watching accidents happen in slow motion. The only place he could afford was a studio apartment in Ukrainian village that he'd found through a hastily Googled search for cheap apartments, Chicago, available immediately. $950 a month, first and last month's rent plus deposit, which wiped out everything he had left and forced him to call his mother, for the first time in 2 years, to beg for a loan. "Honey, what happened? Your father and I saw on LinkedIn that you left the firm. Are you okay?" His mother's voice was concerned but wary, the tone of someone who'd been disappointed before and was bracing for it again. "I'm fine, Mom. Just a career transition. But I need $2,000 to cover moving expenses, just until I get settled in the new position." The lie came easily, smooth as aged whiskey. His mother agreed to wire the money, and Griffin felt the familiar cocktail of relief and self-loathing that came with manipulating the people who loved him. A text from Wade Carrington, his former partner of 10 years. "Don't contact anyone from the firm. Legal has advised complete separation. Your final paycheck will be mailed after deduction of outstanding expenses." Griffin typed and deleted 3 different responses before giving up. What could he possibly say? That he was sorry? That it had all been a misunderstanding? The evidence Cassandra had presented was irrefutable. He'd stolen her work. He'd claimed credit for her brilliance, and he'd done it so systematically, so thoroughly, that it could only have been deliberate. The job search started the next morning, fueled by desperation, and the kind of panic that came from watching your savings account tick down toward zero. Griffin spent 8 hours applying to every commercial real estate firm in Chicago, every financial services company, every position that remotely matched his experience. He used phrases like seeking new challenges and ready for the next chapter, and tried not to think about the fact that his LinkedIn profile had already been updated by Wade's team to show his employment at Ashford Strategic as terminated. The responses started coming in within hours. "Thanks for your interest, but we're not currently hiring. We've decided to move forward with other candidates. Your background doesn't align with our needs at this time." The subtext was clear in every rejection. "We know what you did. We know you were fired for cause. We can't risk the liability of hiring someone with intellectual property theft on their record." By the end of the second week, Griffin had exhausted every lead in commercial real estate. By the end of the third week, he'd expanded his search to adjacent fields: property management, financial consulting, even retail management. "Why do you want to sell Hondas?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken knowledge. Bob had probably Googled him. Bob probably knew exactly why someone with an MBA from Northwestern was applying for a $30,000 a year sales position. "I need a fresh start, a chance to rebuild from the ground up and prove myself on merit." The words tasted like ashes, but Griffin forced them out with something approximating sincerity. "Uh-huh. And you're okay taking orders from me? Working 60-hour weeks on commission? Bringing your own lunch because we don't have a cafeteria?" "Yes, absolutely." Bob studied him for a long moment, probably weighing the risk of hiring someone overqualified and desperate against the potential benefit of having someone with actual sales training on the floor. 30,000 base, 3% commission. You start Monday. Show up late once, you're fired. Lie to a customer once, you're fired. Think you're too good for this work once, you're fired. Clear? Crystal clear. Griffin left the dealership with his first job offer in 6 weeks, and the knowledge that he'd just accepted a position that paid less than his monthly car payment used to be. His first day was an exercise in swallowing pride in bite-sized pieces. Bob assigned him to shadow a 23-year-old named Kyle who'd been selling cars for 18 months and treated Griffin with the kind of condescension usually reserved for incompetent children. So, like, the key is to get them emotionally invested in the car before you talk numbers. Make them picture themselves driving it, you know? Kyle's advice was basic sales 101, material Griffin had mastered in his first year of business school. But he nodded and took notes and said thank you, and tried not to think about how he used to close deals worth more than this entire dealership's annual revenue. His first commission check, 3 weeks later, was for $342 after taxes. Griffin stared at the direct deposit notification and did the math. At this rate, it would take him 4 months to save enough for a security deposit on a better apartment, a year to pay off his credit card debt, a decade to rebuild any semblance of the life he'd had. The humiliation compounded daily. A former client from Ashford Strategic came into the dealership looking at Accords, recognized Griffin, and made a show of asking for a different salesperson. A woman who'd been at one of his and Sienna's dinner parties saw him on the sales floor and actually laughed, a sound that carried across the showroom like a slap. But the worst moments were the quiet ones, late at night in the studio apartment with its Murphy bed and shared bathroom. Griffin would lie awake listening to his neighbors fight and the amateur trumpet player massacre When the Saints Go Marching In, and try to understand how 10 years of his life had unraveled so completely. She was being interviewed about the Theodora Winters Foundation, talking about empowering women in STEM fields and funding scholarships for first-generation college students. She looked powerful. She looked happy. She looked like someone who'd never spent a single night crying in a Motel 6. And I hate that I'm glad for her. I hate that some small, broken part of me is actually proud. The foundation's gala was announced 6 months after the divorce, set for the first Friday in November at the Ritz-Carlton. Tickets were $10,000 each, with all proceeds going toward educational scholarships and animal welfare programs. Griffin saw the announcement on social media, where Cassandra's verified account had accumulated 200,000 followers practically overnight. She'd become a symbol of something: feminine resilience, karmic justice, the triumph of merit over theft. He didn't plan to be anywhere near that gala. He had nothing to do with it, no reason to attend, no possible justification for subjecting himself to that particular humiliation. But then the temp agency called. "We've got an event staffing opportunity. High-end gala, good tips, $15 an hour plus share of the tip pool. Black tie service, so you'll need proper attire. You interested?" Griffin needed the money. His car had sold for $8,000 less than he owed on it, leaving him with a $4,000 gap that had gone to collections. His credit score had dropped below 500. He was $300 short on rent and couldn't ask his mother for money again without admitting he'd lied about the new position. What's the event? Some foundation thing at the Ritz. Theodora Winters Foundation. Should be easy work, just champagne service and... Griffin hung up, stood in his studio apartment staring at the wall, calculated his bank balance against his upcoming bills, called back. "I'll take it." The temp agency sent him the details. Black pants and white button-down shirt provided, black shoes required. Report to the service entrance at 4 p.m. for a 5 p.m. event start. Griffin showed up with 15 minutes to spare. His shoes, the only decent pair that had survived the garbage bag exodus, polished to a mirror shine. The service coordinator, a harried woman named Angela, who was juggling 3 different clipboards, barely looked at him. "You're on champagne service VIP section. Keep your head down, smile when spoken to. Don't engage in conversation unless directly asked a question. We clear?" Crystal. The gala itself was already in full swing by the time the servers were released into the main ballroom. Griffin emerged from the service corridor into a different world. Crystal chandeliers, floor-length gowns, the kind of jewelry that required its own insurance policies. This was the Chicago elite, the power players and old money families whose donations funded museums and universities and political campaigns. And there, at the center of it all, was Cassandra. She wore a midnight blue velvet gown that caught the light like water. The sapphire necklace at her throat probably worth more than Griffin would earn in 5 years. Her auburn hair was styled in loose waves, and when she laughed at something the mayor was saying, the sound carried across the ballroom with unself-conscious joy. Griffin kept his head down, moving through the crowd with a tray of champagne flutes, invisible in the way that service staff always were. He'd mastered this particular form of invisibility as a scholarship student at Northwestern, watching wealthy classmates treat waiters like furniture, learning to hate them even as he envied everything they had. "Waiter," the voice was familiar. Griffin turned, tray balanced carefully, and found himself face to face with Wade Carrington. His former partner of 10 years looked right through him, eyes focusing on the champagne rather than the person holding it. "Champagne, and make it quick." Wade's tone was dismissive, impatient, the voice of someone who'd never questioned his right to immediate service. Griffin swapped an empty glass for a full one, his hand trembling slightly. "Thank you." The words were automatic, meaningless. Wade had already turned back to his conversation, and Griffin retreated toward the kitchen, his heart hammering against his ribs. Wade hadn't recognized him. To the people in this ballroom, servers didn't have faces or histories or lives that extended beyond their function. He made it through the first hour without incident, weaving through conversations about market trends and real estate developments and the latest drama at the country club. The champagne flowed freely, and the guests grew louder and more expansive, their laughter echoing off the high ceilings. Griffin was near the chocolate fountain, preparing to refill his tray, when someone bumped into him from behind. The tray tilted dangerously, champagne sloshing in the crystal flutes. "Watch it!" The voice was female, startled rather than angry. Griffin turned to apologize and found himself looking directly into blue eyes that he'd once known better than his own. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. I didn't see." The words died in his throat as recognition dawned on both sides simultaneously. Cassandra's eyes widened, her expression cycling through surprise to something harder to read. Griffin felt his hands begin to shake, the champagne glasses clinking together like wind chimes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The ballroom noise faded to a dull roar, background static to the electric current running between them. Cassandra's eyes traveled down, taking in the white server's jacket with its fraying cuffs, the cheap black pants, the shoes that were polished but clearly worn. Griffin watched her see him, really see him, in a way she hadn't in years. "Marcus." Her voice was soft, almost gentle, and somehow that was worse than anger would have been. "Cassandra, I mean, Ms. Winters, I didn't know this was your event. The agency didn't say, and I needed the money. I'm not—" He was babbling, words spilling out in a desperate attempt to fill the silence with something other than the weight of their shared history. "You look tired, Griffin." The observation was clinical, delivered without judgment or satisfaction. She wasn't gloating, she was simply noting a fact, the way someone might comment on the weather. It's been hard. The job market, everything. I imagine it has." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the tableau of the gala's host speaking to a server. Alistair Pembroke appeared at Cassandra's elbow, his expression professionally neutral, but his eyes sharp with assessment. "Is there a problem, Miss Winters? Is this staff member bothering you?" "No, please, Mr. Pembroke. I'm just serving champagne. I didn't mean to—" Griffin's voice cracked on the last word, desperation overriding pride. Cassandra raised one hand, and Alistair immediately fell silent. "It's fine, Alistair. I know him. We were married once." The whispers started immediately, spreading through the crowd like ripples on water. "That's the ex-husband, the one who stole her work. Look at him now." Cassandra seemed oblivious to the gossip, her attention focused entirely on Griffin, with an intensity that made him want to disappear into the floor. "Cassandra, I need to say this. I'm sorry. I know it's too late. I know I don't deserve forgiveness or even acknowledgement, but I'm sorry. I see it now. I see what I lost. And I don't mean the money or the career. I mean you. The person you always were that I was too blind and stupid and arrogant to value. The words came out in a rush, unpolished and desperate, nothing like the smooth presentations he used to deliver. This was raw truth, painful and humiliating and absolutely necessary. Cassandra looked at him for a long moment, and Griffin couldn't read her expression. There was no anger there, no triumph, no satisfaction at his obvious suffering. There was something else, something that looked almost like peace. You're right, Griffin. It is too late, but I accept your apology. She turned away, her gown swishing slightly, and Alistair followed, already redirecting her attention to the next cluster of donors. The crowd parted for her, closing behind like water, and Griffin was left standing alone with his tray of champagne and $100 bill that felt heavier than gold. He stood there for 30 seconds, maybe longer, watching her move through the ballroom with the kind of confidence that came from knowing exactly who you were and what you were worth. She didn't look back, not once. And somehow that was the most devastating part, not that she'd humiliated him, but that she'd moved on so completely that he no longer warranted a second glance. Griffin's hand trembled as he picked up the bill and slipped it into his pocket. The money would cover his electric bill and leave enough for groceries. He needed it, had no choice but to take it. But the shame of accepting it burned hotter than any anger he'd felt in the past 6 months. He pushed through the kitchen doors, leaving the golden light and music behind, stepping into the harsh, fluorescent reality of the service corridor. Angela, the coordinator, was there with her clipboards, checking off names. "Everything okay? You look pale." "Fine, just need a minute." Griffin found the staff bathroom and locked himself in a stall, his breath coming in sharp gasps that bordered on hyperventilation. He'd spent months imagining what he'd say if he ever saw Cassandra again. He'd rehearsed speeches, crafted apologies, built elaborate scenarios where she'd see how much he'd changed, and maybe, possibly, offer some path toward redemption. The reality had been nothing like his fantasies. She'd been kind. That was somehow worse than cruelty would have been. She'd acknowledged his apology and dismissed him with the same calm professionalism she might use with any stranger. He didn't matter to her anymore. He was just another person in a very crowded room. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of champagne service and appetizer distribution. Griffin avoided the area where Cassandra was holding court, kept his head down, focused on the mechanical aspects of the work. At 11 p.m., when the last guest finally departed and the cleanup crew descended on the ballroom, he collected his share of the tip pool, an additional $43, and slipped out through the service entrance. The November air was cold enough to hurt, the first real taste of the winter Cassandra had warned him about. Griffin walked to the nearest CTA station, his cheap shoes clicking against the pavement, his white server's jacket inadequate against the wind. The $100 bill in his pocket felt like both salvation and condemnation. 1 year later, on another cold November evening, Griffin stood in the same CTA station, wearing a different jacket, manager's blazer from the Honda dealership, where he'd been promoted 6 months earlier. His salary had increased to $65,000 a year, enough to move into a one-bedroom apartment with its own bathroom. He'd paid off his credit card debt and started rebuilding his credit score point by painful point. The dealership job had taught him things that his MBA never had: humility, patience, the value of honest work performed with integrity. He'd learned to see customers as people rather than transactions, to take pride in helping a single mother find reliable transportation within her budget, to celebrate small victories instead of constantly chasing the next big deal. He'd also started volunteering at a homeless shelter on the South Side, serving meals every Saturday morning to people whose circumstances had destroyed them in ways that made Griffin's own fall look gentle by comparison. The work was hard and often heartbreaking, but it gave him something his career never had: a sense of purpose disconnected from profit and prestige. His therapist said he was making progress. His mother said she was proud of him. His father, a man of few words, had sent him a text that simply read, "Keep going." Griffin pulled out his phone and opened the note app where he'd been drafting and redrafting a letter to Cassandra for the past 8 months. 47 versions, each one an attempt to articulate something that felt increasingly impossible to express. The latest attempt was shorter than most. "Dear Cassandra, I don't expect you to read this. I don't even know if I'll send it. But I need to say, thank you. Thank you for seeing through my bullshit. Thank you for not enabling my ego. Thank you for being strong enough to walk away. You deserved so much better than I gave you. I hope you're happy. I hope you found someone who sees your worth from the beginning instead of learning it too late. I'm working on seeing my own. Sincerely, Griffin." He saved it with the others, all those unsent messages accumulating like archaeological layers of regret and growth. Maybe someday he'd send one. Maybe he'd never send any of them. Maybe the point wasn't the sending, but the writing. The act of examining his own failures with enough honesty to change. Meanwhile, across the city in the townhouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, though Cassandra spent most of her time now in Chicago, in the penthouse office that had been built on top of what was now the Winters building, a different scene was unfolding. Cassandra sat in the library with David, the architect she'd been dating for 4 months. He was kind, brilliant, treated her like an equal partner, and made her laugh in a way she'd forgotten was possible. They weren't talking about Griffin. They rarely did. He'd become background noise, a cautionary tale she occasionally referenced in interviews about resilience and second acts. The Theodora Winters Foundation had just announced its largest scholarship program yet, $200 million to fund education for first-generation college students, with a particular focus on women in STEM fields. The foundation's impact report showed that 12,000 students had received support in the first year alone. 45 animal shelters had been built or renovated. The Economic Empowerment Program had helped 600 women start small businesses. These numbers meant something. They represented real lives changed, real futures made possible. David was showing her plans for a new shelter in Pilsen, his drawings spread across the library table. The design was beautiful and functional, incorporating natural light and open spaces that would make the animals feel safe while attracting potential adopters. What if we added a community room here, somewhere volunteers can gather, where we could hold training sessions? Cassandra studied the plans, her mind already seeing the possibilities. Yes, and maybe a small cafe, something that could generate revenue to help fund operations and give people a reason to visit, even if they're not adopting right away. They worked together for another hour, refining the design, debating details, building something new out of combined vision and mutual respect. This, Cassandra thought, was what partnership was supposed to feel like. Not one person diminishing themselves so another could shine, but two people creating something neither could build alone. Her phone buzzed with a notification, a news alert about Ashford's strategic group announcing record profits under new leadership. Wade Carrington had brought in a new team, implemented Cassandra's analytical framework properly attributed, and rebuilt the client relationships that Griffin had damaged. The firm was thriving, which meant her decision to save it rather than destroy it had been correct. Justice, she'd learned, wasn't about punishment. It was about restoring balance. Griffin had lost his position and his prestige, but he'd also been given the opportunity to rebuild himself into someone better. Whether he took that opportunity or not was beyond her control. Doctor, Sterling had asked her once, in one of their sessions, if she'd do it all again, the marriage, the sacrifice, the betrayal, knowing how it would end. No, I wouldn't choose that pain, but I also wouldn't trade who I am now for who I was then. Sometimes we have to walk through fire to discover we're made of something that doesn't burn. That quote had ended up in a magazine profile, had been screenshot and shared thousands of times across social media, had become one of those phrases that people referenced when talking about resilience and transformation. Cassandra had been embarrassed by the attention, but Morgan had pointed out that sometimes people needed to hear that survival was possible, that they could rebuild from devastation and emerge stronger. The clock in the library chimed midnight. David started gathering his drawings, preparing to head back to his own apartment, respecting the boundaries they'd established about not rushing physical intimacy. Before he left, he turned to her with a question he'd been clearly working up the courage to ask. The gala next month. I know it's a big event, lots of press. Would you want me there? As your date, officially? Cassandra considered the question, thought about what it would mean to go public with this relationship, to let the world see her with someone who wasn't a trophy or an accessory, but an actual partner. Yes, I'd like that very much. After David left, Cassandra stood at the window, overlooking the private garden, watching the first snowflakes of the season begin to fall. Somewhere in Chicago, Griffin Ashford was probably in his one-bedroom apartment, maybe writing in that journal his therapist had recommended, maybe thinking about the choices that had led him to rebuild his life from nothing. She hoped he was learning. She hoped he was growing. She hoped someday he'd use what he'd learned to be better to the next person who trusted him. But mostly, she hoped he'd find the same things she'd found. That worth wasn't measured in bank accounts or corner offices or social media followers. It was measured in integrity, in the ability to stand in front of a mirror and recognize the person looking back. The snow was falling harder now, covering the garden in white, erasing the evidence of the season that had passed, and preparing the ground for whatever would grow next spring. Cassandra placed her hand against the cold glass, feeling the chill seep through, and smiled. She'd told the interviewer from Forbes that she'd existed in a different stratosphere than Griffin, and it had become one of those quotes that defined her public narrative. But the real truth was simpler and more profound. They'd always existed in different stratospheres. He thought money was the sky, that status was oxygen, that power was the atmosphere itself. But the real stratosphere, the one that mattered, the one that sustained life, was built on something else entirely, on compassion and integrity and the courage to grow, on the willingness to do hard things and to do them right, on the understanding that true wealth had nothing to do with what you owned and everything to do with who you became. Griffin had been right about one thing, all those months ago in the divorce attorney's office. They did exist in different stratospheres. He'd just gotten the direction backwards. And maybe, just maybe, someday he'd understand that too.